confident individuals stop explaining once a point has landed. This is a documented dominance behavior in negotiations and interrogations. Extra explanation increases attack surface by adding details that can be challenged. In practice, this is done by stating the position once and not expanding it further. The interaction tightens because there is no new material to push against. This immediately shifts effort to the other side, who must now supply the next move. When this is used on someone, it feels like the conversation closes earlier than expected. They sense finality without being given a reason to accept or reject. The usable insight is that fewer words preserve control at the moment agreement or resistance appears. Short answers change the balance of an exchange. Providing only what is required prevents the conversation from expanding into negotiation. This works because questions often seek leverage, not information. In practice, the response is complete but stripped of examples, stories, or justification. Nothing extra is offered that could be redirected or reframed. The immediate result is reduced momentum for the person asking. When this is used on someone, it feels blunt and slightly limiting. They notice there is no opening to pull more detail from. The usable insight is that precision limits influence attempts by controlling what enters the exchange. Delaying a response alters perceived control. A pause after a question disrupts the other side's timing and expectations. This works because urgency weakens judgment in live interactions. In practice, the reply is held for a moment longer than normal, without explanation. The silence forces attention back onto the person waiting. The immediate result is a slowdown in pressure and pace. When this is used on someone, the pause feels deliberate and unsettling. They begin adjusting their tone or position without being prompted. The usable insight is that controlling timing shifts control of the interaction itself. Repeating the same statement without adding detail stabilizes authority. When challenged, the wording stays identical instead of evolving. This works because changes signal uncertainty or openness to renegotiation. In practice, the original sentence is restated calmly, without clarification. Nothing new is introduced that can be argued against. The interaction stops progressing sideways. When this is used on someone, it feels like pressing against something fixed. They realize escalation will not produce new ground. The usable insight is that consistency limits manipulation by refusing to supply fresh material. Refusing to justify a decision preserves leverage. When asked why a standard exists, no reasoning is supplied. This works because explanations invite evaluation and debate. In practice, the decision is restated without defending how it was formed. The focus stays on the outcome, not the process. The immediate result is fewer angles to challenge. When this is used on someone, it feels closed and non-negotiable. They search for reasons and find none offered. The usable insight is that withholding justification prevents others from reshaping the terms. Ignoring emotional bait maintains control of the exchange. Emotional language is often introduced to force explanation or apology. This works because emotion pressures the other side to justify or soften a position. In practice, the response stays factual and unchanged despite the emotional tone. No reassurance is added. No emotional alignment is offered. The interaction does not shift into defense. When this is used on someone, it feels like their emotion has no effect on direction. The usable insight is that refusing emotional engagement blocks leverage attempts built on feeling rather than facts. Silence can be used as a control mechanism after a statement is made. When speech stops instead of continuing, the other side is left to react without guidance. This works because many interactions rely on verbal cues to know when to push or retreat. In practice, nothing is said after the point is delivered, even if a response is expected. No filler words are used to soften the gap. The pause itself becomes part of the message. When this is used on someone, the quiet feels intentional and slightly pressuring. They often speak next to relieve the discomfort or regain momentum. The usable insight is that controlled silence shifts effort and exposure onto the other side. Limiting clarification narrows control over the discussion. When asked to explain further, only one small part is addressed while the rest is left untouched. This works because full clarification opens multiple paths for challenge. In practice, the response answers a single detail and then stops. Everything outside that detail remains closed. The conversation moves forward on a tight channel instead of spreading. When this is used on someone, it feels like progress without relief. They receive enough to continue but not enough to redirect the exchange. The usable insight is that selective clarification controls direction by deciding what can and cannot advance. Allowing a misunderstanding to stand can preserve leverage. Correcting every false assumption often pulls someone into defense. This works because clarification can signal concern about how one is perceived. In practice, the interaction continues without fixing the misinterpretation. No effort is made to realign the other side's framing. The focus stays on outcomes rather than accuracy. When this is used on someone, it feels unresolved and slightly destabilizing. They adjust their own position without being guided. The usable insight is that not correcting everything avoids unnecessary exposure and keeps control intact. At a certain point, explanation is expected to finish the exchange. Nothing is added after the position is stated. No closing detail appears to seal it. The interaction pauses there without resolution.